November 14, 1949, 11:32 p.m. The Lenox Lounge, 288 Lenox Avenue. The Lenox Lounge, 288 Lenox Avenue. The barrel of the .38 snub-nose didn't shake. It was fixed like a steel compass needle, pointing directly between the eyes of Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson. This wasn't a warning. This was an execution in progress. 3 feet of mahogany tables separated the King of Harlem from a man who had dissolved bodies in New Jersey acid vats for Frank Costello. The air in the lounge, usually thick with the sweet smoke of expensive cigars and the rhythm of bebop, had curdled into a vacuum of terrified silence. $100,000 in weekly numbers racket skim was on the table, but in that frozen moment, the money was just paper. The only currency that mattered was time. The man holding the gun had the drop. He had the motive. He had the green light from the Genovese crime family. By all laws of physics and ballistics, Bumpy Johnson was already a corpse slumped in the Art Deco booth. But Bumpy didn't blink. He didn't plead. He watched the hammer of the gun pull back with the clinical detachment of a man watching a traffic light change. Most men die in the second they realize they are trapped. Bumpy Johnson lived because he knew something the hitman didn't. He knew that in the geometry of violence, a 2-second delay is an eternity, and he knew exactly how to manufacture it. 3 weeks earlier, the delicate ecosystem of the New York underworld had begun to fracture. Bumpy Johnson was not merely a gangster, he was a gatekeeper. By 1949, he had spent nearly 2 decades carving out a kingdom in Harlem that operated with the precision of a Fortune 500 company. He wasn't just a thug with a knife. He was an intellectual who quoted Nietzsche and played chess with a grandmaster's foresight. He walked the streets of 125th not as a predator, but as a landlord. He paid rent for widows, bought turkeys for the poor, and in return, he demanded absolute loyalty. He was the buffer between the predatory Italian syndicates downtown and the black community of Harlem. But the winds were changing. The post-war boom was fading, and the Italian mob led by the cunning Frank Costello and the ruthless Vito Genovese was looking to consolidate. They were tired of the Harlem arrangement. For years, they had worked with Bumpy, accepting a percentage of the lucrative numbers, gamed the illegal lottery that served as the poor man's stock market. The numbers racket in Harlem was generating an estimated $50 million annually. The Italians wanted more than a slice. They wanted the whole bakery. Tensions had escalated throughout October. A bagman for the Genovese family was found beaten unconscious in an alley behind the Apollo Theater on 125th Street. 2 days later, one of Bumpy's runners was thrown through the plate glass window of a tailor shop on 7th Avenue. The message was clear. The partnership was over. The Italians didn't want a war. Wars were expensive and drew police attention. They wanted the decapitation. They needed Bumpy Johnson removed publicly and definitively to shatter the myth of his invincibility. If Bumpy fell, Harlem would fall. Every runner, every banker, every shopkeeper paying protection would have no choice but to bow to downtown management. The instrument chosen for this decapitation was Vincent the Butcher Moretti. Moretti was not a street soldier. He was a specialist, a phantom in a tailored suit. He had earned his nickname not for his trade, but for his methodology in the Brooklyn dock wars of the mid-1940s. He was credited with 12 hits, none of which ever resulted in an arrest. He was a man of zero imagination and absolute efficiency. Moretti was dangerous because he was disciplined. He didn't drink on the job. He didn't talk trash. He didn't make mistakes. He was a grim accountant of death who balanced the books with lead. His mandate from Costello was simple: walk into Bumpy's sanctuary, put a bullet in his head, and walk out. It was to be a statement of ultimate disrespect. Killing Bumpy in a dark alley was one thing. Killing him in the zebra room of the Lenox Lounge, his office, his throne room, was a declaration of conquest. The Italians believed Bumpy had grown soft. They believed the professor had spent too much time reading books and not enough time squeezing triggers. They saw a man approaching 45, comfortable in his power, and mistook his composure for complacency. Moretti arrived in Harlem at 11 a.m. in a black Packard. He carried a .38 caliber revolver, a weapon chosen for its reliability. He had checked the action 3 times. He had 6 rounds. He had 6 rounds. He only intended to use 1. He viewed Bumpy Johnson not as a legend, but as a transaction to be closed. The setup was designed to be inescapable. Moretti had requested a sit-down to discuss a renegotiation of the percentage split. It was a ruse, of course, and a thin one. Bumpy agreed to the meeting at the Lenox Lounge. To the outside observer, it looked like Bumpy was walking into the lion's mouth. The Lenox Lounge was the heartbeat of Harlem nightlife. The Zebra Room, with its distinctive black and white animal print leather booths and low amber lighting, was usually a place of laughter and clinking glasses, but tonight the atmosphere was brittle. At 11:15 p.m., Bumpy Johnson entered. He was dressed impeccably in a charcoal double-breasted suit, a white silk scarf loosely draped around his neck. He moved with a gliding grace, nodding to the bartender, acknowledging the piano player. He sat in his usual booth 4, which offered a panoramic view of the entrance and the mirrored walls. At 11:25 p.m., Moretti walked in. He was flanked by 2 associates who remained by the door, effectively blocking the exit. Moretti slid into the booth opposite Bumpy. He didn't take off his coat. The sensory details of the next 7 minutes were etched into the memories of the 6 witnesses who dared to watch. The smell of stale beer mixed with the sharp scent of Moretti's bay rum aftershave. The jukebox was playing a slow, mournful blues track, the bass notes vibrating through the floorboards. "You're late, Vince," Bumpy said. His voice was a low rumble devoid of fear. "Traffic," Moretti replied. He placed his hands flat on the table. "We're not here to negotiate, Bumpy. We're here to close the account." At 11:32 p.m., the conversation stopped. Moretti moved with blinding speed. One moment his hand was on the table. The next, the .38 was leveled at Bumpy's forehead. The click of the hammer cocking back was louder than the music. The room froze. The bartender stopped polishing a glass. The piano player lifted his hands from the keys. This was the 8 minutes. For 8 agonizing minutes, Moretti held the gun steady. He didn't fire immediately. He wanted Bumpy to sweat. He wanted the King of Harlem to beg. He wanted the witnesses to see Bumpy Johnson broken before he was destroyed. "The commission is tired of your arithmetic," Moretti sneered, his finger whitening on the trigger. "You're done, right here, in your own house." Bumpy didn't recoil. He didn't look at the gun. He looked directly into Moretti's eyes. He picked up his glass of scotch, the ice clinking softly, the only sound in the room. He took a sip. The tension was a physical weight, pressing down on the lungs of everyone in the room. 11:35, 11:38, 11:38, 11:40. Bumpy placed the glass down. He leaned forward, closing the distance between his face and the muzzle by an inch. He was violating the survival instinct of every living creature. Then Bumpy spoke. He didn't raise his voice. He spoke with the casual indifference of a man ordering a sandwich. What Moretti didn't know he couldn't possibly have known was that Bumpy Johnson had played this scene out in his head 100 times before Moretti ever crossed 110th Street. Bumpy knew the Italians viewed arrogance as a weapon. He knew Moretti would want to gloat. He knew Moretti would need that moment of dominance. And Bumpy knew the architecture of the Lenox Lounge better than the architect. Bumpy had spent the previous 3 days not gathering soldiers but adjusting the environment. He had instructed the maintenance man to adjust the angle of the large decorative mirror behind the bar by exactly 4 degrees. He had placed a specific man, a young sharp-eyed shooter named Red, in the shadows of the mezzanine, a location that was usually closed on weeknights. The 2-second difference wasn't about hand speed. It was about cognitive processing. Bumpy had to break Moretti's OODA loop: observe, orient, decide, act. He had to make Moretti doubt his reality for just a fragment of time. At 11:40 and 30 seconds, with the gun still aimed at his brain, Bumpy delivered the 3 words. He smiled, a cold, predatory baring of teeth, and whispered, "Check the mirror." It was a command, not a request. It was spoken with such absolute conviction that Moretti's brain rebelled. Why the mirror? Is someone behind me? Is this a trick? The human brain cannot help but seek information when presented with a blind spot threat. For exactly 1.5 seconds, Moretti's eyes flickered. He didn't turn his head. He was too disciplined for that. But his focus shifted. His eyes darted up and to the left, to the mirror behind the bar. In that mirror, Moretti saw the reflection of the mezzanine. He saw the glint of steel from the shadows above. That was the hesitation. That was the gap. In the 0.5 seconds it took for Moretti to process the threat from above, Bumpy moved. He didn't draw a gun from a holster. He slapped the barrel of Moretti's .38 sideways with his left hand, the heat of the discharged bullet singing past his ear and shattering the zebra skin upholstery behind him. Simultaneously, Bumpy's right hand didn't go for a gun. It went for the ice pick taped beneath the table, alleged a tool of the trade in Harlem disputes. Bumpy drove the steel spike down not into Moretti's chest, but through the back of his gun hand, pinning it to the mahogany table. The scream that tore from Moretti's throat was primal. The .38 clattered uselessly on the table, anchored by the impaled hand. It was 11:41 p.m. The two associates at the door reached for their weapons, but the sound of two distinct shotgun racks from the mezzanine froze them in place. Red had stepped into the light. A sawed-off 12-gauge pointed directly at the entrance. Moretti writhed, pinned to the table, blood pooling on the polished wood. Bumpy stood up, adjusting his silk scarf. He looked down at the man who had held his life in a trigger squeeze just seconds ago. The room remained silent, but the quality of the silence had changed. It was no longer the silence of terror. It was the silence of awe. Bumpy didn't kill him. Death would have been a mercy. Bumpy leaned in close to Moretti's sweating, pale face. "You go back to Frank," Bumpy said, his voice level. "You tell him that in Harlem, we don't look at the gun. We look at the man holding it. And you tell him this table is reserved." Bumpy yanked the ice pick free. Moretti collapsed back against the booth, clutching his mangled hand. "Get him out of here," Bumpy ordered the associates. "He's bleeding on the floor." The associates, pale and shaking, dragged the sobbing hitman out of the Lenox Lounge. They scrambled into the Packard and peeled away toward 125th Street, leaving a trail of blood and shattered pride. By midnight, the story was already traveling to the telephone wires and speakeasies of New York. Bumpy Johnson hadn't just survived. He had dismantled a top Cosa Nostra enforcer without firing a shot. The Italians held a meeting at the Copacabana the next morning. The decision was unanimous. Bumpy Johnson was too dangerous to touch. The truce was reinstated. The percentage split remained unchanged. The incident at the Lenox Lounge became a cornerstone of the Bumpy Johnson mythology. It illustrated the fundamental difference between a gangster and a boss. A gangster relies on the weapon in his hand. A boss relies on the weapon in his mind. This moment cemented Bumpy's control over Harlem for the next decade, until his eventual imprisonment. It sent a message that echoed far beyond 125th Street. Harlem was not a colony to be exploited. It was a sovereign nation, and Bumpy was its king. The lesson of the 2-second difference is timeless. In any confrontation, whether in a boardroom, a street fight, or a negotiation, the person who controls the perception of reality controls the outcome. Bumpy won not because he was faster, but because he was prepared. He understood that distractions are deadly, and that the greatest advantage you can have is the arrogance of your opponent. Real power isn't about the gun. It's about knowing exactly when to make your opponent look away. If this story showed you why Bumpy was the smartest man to ever run Harlem, hit subscribe. Drop a like if you respect the code of the old school. Comment below. Would you have looked at the mirror? Next week, we dive into the day Bumpy Johnson challenged the entire NYPD to a fistfight.